Hello, I'm Francesca Tarocco, and I'm the director of NICHE, quite happily. And we have a wonderful community here. We have a couple of visiting scholars right now. I see them here. We have a lot of things going on. So if you want to join our newsletter, please do. We can't spam you. We have to obtain your permission to send us our newsletter. So you could write to our address, niche@unive.it, and you can get our newsletter. Other ways to keep up with our activities, of course, you can look at our website, and we also have an Instagram account. Tonight, we are very happy and fortunate to have with us Professor Steve Mentz, who is really one of the prominent figures in the Blue Humanities. He has just authored one introduction to the Blue Humanities, a wonderful book that will soon be in our library here, in our reading room at NICHE. He's already a friend of NICHE and has been working with some of us for many years. He's professor of English at St. John University in New York City, and author of many books and co-author of many books and articles. He's also a blogger, and that's a wonderful thing to do. You know, keeps still. You know, it's a wonderful thing to do. And as I was saying earlier, he's the author also of the book Ocean, that was recently translated into Italian. And tonight, and in fact, we have a new book, which I believe you'll be talking. Yes, so this is the new book, Sailing Without Ahab, which is what we will hear tonight. So we will have a Q&A. We will have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask at the end. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
We go. Is that better? Can people hear? Okay, good. So I will talk a little bit about the book Sailing Without Ahab, which is a little bit of an experimental book for me, and more of a creative than or at least as much of a creative as a scholarly effort. And then also the second half, the larger half of the talk, will be engaging with the figure of Achilles from Homer's Iliad and the question of the relationship of heroism to the river, and more broadly, human agency with watery environments. So I guess I can start now. It looks like we have the tech working, and sorry for the little delay there. So the title of the talk is The Submersion of the Hero, a Blue Humanities Paradigm. And I'll hopefully explain what that means over the course of our conversation. When heroes get wet, they lose some of their power. That's a good thing. Heroism, especially classical masculine ideas about heroism that come with connotations of force, authority, and violence, clash with basic ecological concepts such as interconnection and non-hierarchical entanglements. Heroes, those massive figures who aim to stand tall and dominate the horizon, are bad for the world, even if they claim to be on our side. A Blue Humanities view of human power in the Anthropocene requires the submersion of the hero. In the water, threats of violence, rage for control, and the application of force all become reconfigured. There remains a place for human agency, but not for domination. In today's talk, I will submerge two well-known literary heroes. The first will be Captain Ahab, the sailor who hunts the white whale across the global wonder world of the ocean in Melville's 19th century American novel, Moby Dick. Second, I'll reach all the way back to classical antiquity to look at Achilles, the warrior hero of Homer's nearly 3 millennia old epic, the Iliad, with a focus in the latter text in his struggle against the river god Scamander. These two examples of heroism greatly need the disorienting twist of submersion. These two submersions come to us during a time of environmental threat. They speak of freedom, uncertainty, waywardness, and, I hope, a buoyancy sufficient to the task. To put the issue in the simplest terms, heroes pose an ecological problem. The power of capital M, man, the violating pressure of the figure I call old man Anthropos, the hero villain of the Anthropocene, distorts the ecological operations of our world. These big men take up too much room and leave behind too much damage. The blue humanities paradigm of submersion hazards that maybe water can help provide a solution. Shall we splash in? Okay, good. Part 1, Sailing Without Ahab. As I submerge Captain Ahab, I'll take this opportunity to tell the origin story of my new book of poems. And here is the pre-publication copy that maybe we can send around if anybody wants to sort of circulate it around the room. You're happy to do that. I do need to get it back at the end. And I also have a few flyers if anybody wants to take one at the end of the talk or pass them around now. The book is not out until April 2nd, but pre-orders make everybody happy, especially me. And my press. This book is a love letter to the great American water epic Moby Dick. It also performs my own personal act or repeated acts of submersion. In 138 poems, this book drowns the captain and submerges my own body. The book sails out onto ocean, but we leave the bad man at home. To sail without means no hero, no order, no aching rage to dominate. The book's cover, which is up on the slide, shows a blue-green oceanic whale floating into a sea of words. And I thank former St. John's graduate student Adelea Cinquemani for this gorgeous image. But even more clarifying for my talk today is the map, which is on the other side of the slide. I hope you can see it. It's right behind me. I've got maybe a better, slightly bigger picture of it there, which was created by John Wyatt Greenlee of Surprised Eel Mapping. As I hope you can see, maybe I can slide just a little bit out of the way. On this map, the bottom or upside down half of the map traces the familiar continents of the watery globe. And you can see Africa, South America, and Australia in the inverted global map on the bottom half of this image. But the top half, and the dotted line, which you see tracing through both halves of the map, is, at least on the bottom half of the image, the voyage of the Pequod in Melville's Moby Dick, which begins on the island of Nantucket in the northeastern United States and ends up on the Sea of Japan, where they encounter the white whale. But the top half of the map follows and merges with my own local swimming waters around coastal Connecticut, where I live, skirting Green Island, Whale Rock, and Johnson's Beach, where my dogs and I walk every morning around sunrise, except I guess when I'm in Venice. If you come visit me this summer, that's where we'll go swimming. In this composite map, these two worlds submerge themselves together. I drown the hero in both local and global waters. To give you a taste of the voyage, I'll mimic the structure of epic and start in the middle. Here's one poem plucked out from the center of the book's middle called Let the Oil Out. It's about whaling. Let flesh be light. Spermaceti blazes best, the clearest, brightest, most insightful. neither smell nor smoke, but only glistening, pure. Even the shadows its light cast outline themselves with precision. As if by that light and that light only, I sees into the heart of things, ocean's wet soul and constant motions. This poem represents whaling without money, without greed, without ownership. The ship sails after light, not profit. We leave the captain on shore. So much flows from that one man's not presence. What can we find in an Anthropocene that has jettisoned its anthropos? The poem proffers some answers, oblique though they be. In place of violence, light. There's a heart light that flows from whale flesh. There's still salty blood in the water, but whale flesh candles into whale light so that some hearts, some things, some motions and oceans become visible. You may have realized by now that this book and this part of the talk doesn't follow the conventions of traditional academic lectures. I don't always read original poetry from the front of the lecture hall. Even if we assume, as I think we should assume, that the eco-humanities offers unusual latitude for play and experiment, you might say that I'm going a bit far in this act of academic self-submersion. But I think there's a payoff. Turning away from the captain hero, the driving force, the obsession that fuels the quest, means that the waters embrace us differently. There's still blood and still danger. We still can't breathe underwater. The sea remains inhospitable, alluring, and alien. But we're not imposing any straight line onto its curved surface. Uncaptained, the whale ship charts a route out of the global hunting grounds into a more personal space. Sometimes waywardness finds the best way. There's a second benefit from sailing without, which maybe you heard in the poem I just quoted. Something happens to I in this voyage of submersion. The one-letter word in these poems divides itself in two, so that each I, each first person, each seeing eyeball, becomes two people. One is me, a writer, thinker, swimmer who lives on the Connecticut shoreline in the northeastern coast of the United States in the 21st century. The other is Ishmael, Melville's schoolteacher, bow oarsman, narrator, bullshit artist. Every I in the book embraces us both. Speaking oneself, speaking myself, speaking I-self, through this split is one way to sit near the center, but not be a hero. To feel more division and submersion at work, I'd have to read a lot more poems than I have time for today, since I'd also want to wrestle with glorious doomed Achilles. But I'll close this section of the talk about my book from the future with a little snippet from the end of the introduction, in which I explain how to read such a book and how a flexible attitude toward reading might submerge some of the iron conventions of our literary and cultural histories. So this part is called No Story, No Order, No Ending. Here's the way I plays the game. I opens my book at random, reads, turns the pages. Sometimes I splashes ahead 2, 3, 6 poems at a time. Sometimes I flip forward 20 pages, or sometimes back 30. Every page might open a new turning, a new sorting. There's no order, which means no story, which means no ending. Whales are out there, but we are not sailing straight for them. It's not the usual reader's quest, but it's an ancient practice, the sortes Virgilianae, recently digitized by the glorious lamented Twitter bot @MobyDick at sea. There's always a sacred book to show the way forward. Page numbers need not constrain you. We aren't seeking anything. The white whale swims, dives, feeds, but he's not what we're after. How does it feel to wander with I, aimless, sleepy, philosophical, to trace sideways across these pages, to turn for any reason or none, to move by I's own not understood rhythm? It's hard to know how to end. I grant you that. But fortunately today, we don't have to end just yet, which brings me to part 2, Achilles in the river. My second submersion flows out of the distant past of our shared literary culture, the ancient Greek epics of Homer. The particular submersion I select from antiquity, however, does not follow the familiar swimming routes of Odysseus, but instead highlights the battle between child god Achilles and river god Scamander outside the gates of Troy. By focusing on what the French philosopher Michel Serres, in the book that's on the other half of the slide, calls the blind violence done to the river by the greatest of human warriors, I follow Serres in connecting this episode in Homer with the ecosystemic violence that we now call the Anthropocene. Our culture, Serres notes, abhors the world. We don't hate Troy or individual Trojans anymore, if we ever did, and we perhaps admire warriors just a little bit less than we once did, but the waters of our world still pay the price. The voice of the water, perhaps, can extend Serres' desire to reject the glory of Achilles, whose valor comes from laurels won at limitless, endlessly renewed war. But the god Scamander remains an alien presence in the poem and in our culture. This part of my talk follows Serres' reading of Achilles in the river as an ancient representation of environmental destruction that has become newly urgent in the Anthropocene. For Serres, the required move, the escape from the hero's dilemma, would be to eschew both war and environmental destruction. What is to be done, he asked, with this river, once mute, which is starting to burst its banks? Does the swelling come from springtime or the squabble? 24 years into the 21st century, 32 years on from Serres' book, we know today that old man Anthropos is the cause. Today's catastrophic river floods happen in large part due to human activity. But it's still not clear exactly how to feel about these encounters. By looking a little bit more closely than Serres does at Book 21 of the Iliad across 3 radically different modern English translations, I aim to present this pre-climactic episode in Homer as a kind of partially taken detour that lures the poem off course before it refines its channel in the death of Hector in Book 22. That combat, the culmination of hundreds of violent deaths in the epic, rightly occupies the human heart of the battle before the walls of Troy. When Hector falls, so falls the great city and the monuments of human civilization for which it stands. But outside the walls, before he finds Hector, Achilles encounters a different kind of struggle, which does not lead to a clean kill. 5 years ago, and for years and even a couple of decades, I've been elaborating an anti-heroic ethic as part of what's become known as the Blue Humanities. Against an ancient and still thriving narrative tide, I suggest that we need to invert our conquering heroes and domineering tyrants. This inversion happens best in proximity to water. And at the bottom of Shakespeare's Ocean in 2009, I wrote that we need sailors and swimmers to supplement our oversupply of warriors and heroes. 11 years later in Ocean, and more recently in the Italian Oceano, published just last year by Wetlands Books here in Venice, I elaborated the ways that Homer's meandering hero Odysseus speaks more clearly to our blue world than Achilles with his obsession with glory and violence. Odysseus, as I enumerate in this book, is boat builder, meteorologist, trickster, sailor, and swimmer, while Achilles is just the very best fighter. Today, I want to interrogate more closely the moment in which godlike Achilles submerges himself in the non-human. He survives submersion to stalk his human prey, but just barely. I will draw on this episode as presented in Emily Wilson. I will draw first in this episode as presented in Emily Wilson's fluent new translation of the Iliad, written in English's heroic meter iambic pentameter. Her doomed hero assumes familiar outlines. In her rendition of the epic's opening lines, for example, Achilles emerges from cataclysmic wrath to cause his fellow Greeks immeasurable pain. But the hero we see wrestling with the river god in Book 21 is neither the moody tent sulker of the early books, nor the terrifying lion who butchers Hector in single combat. Instead, the Achilles of Book 21 encounters water in the form of the river god Scamander. He may not intend to ruin the environment, but he can't help himself. With just his sword, he leaps into the river, his heart intent on ruin like a god. To leap in like a god represents Achilles as his destructive self, a hero whose rage torments and terrifies both Greeks and Trojans. In this moment, he represents, as Serre shows, the anthropos of the Anthropocene at its most fiery and destructive. Concentrated into his own singular anger against the Trojans, Achilles threatens his environment, but not intentionally. Some people just accidentally make the world burn. Homer's narrative emphasizes that Achilles kills humans, and these acts of butchery wound the environment. Facing Priam's son Lycaon, who earlier in the war Achilles had captured and then ransomed back to his father at Troy, the Greek hero describes humanity in conflict with non-human nature. You will get no help, he sneers at Lycaon's bleeding body, from this fair river with its silver streams. Earlier, Achilles had scoffed even at the deep and salty sea, which had returned the once captive and thence freed Lycaon to Troy. With every word and violent action, Achilles asserts anthropic violence against his human foes and against the non-human background to their combat. In Serre's terms, his is a rage that abhors the world, but more in the manner of contempt and scorn than hatred or rivalry. The form of the word abhors conjures an English language pun that Shakespeare enjoys deploying, in which hatred or abhorrence makes a prostitute or object of contemptuous love out of its object. Achilles, and as Anthropos, makes nature his whore and uses her brutally. The river responds to the hero's pollution by matching human rage with divine anger. The counter-violence of the river gods demonstrates how this episode speaks to our Anthropocene condition and the Blue Humanities paradigm of submersion. I'll look at Scamander's challenge to Achilles in 3 very different translations, but I'll start with Wilson's at some length to clarify the narrative stakes of the encounter. The river assumes human form and speaks to the hero. Achilles, you are more powerful than other men, more capable of doing dreadful harm. The gods are constantly protecting you, but even if great Zeus, son of Kronos, enables you to slaughter all the Trojans, at least drive them away from me. Perform your horrifying actions on the plain. My lovely streams have been clogged up with corpses. I cannot freely pour my waters down into the shining sea because the bodies choke me, yet you keep killing even more, annihilating everyone. Come on, leader of troops, stop now. This is too much. The allegorical structure of this encounter should, in the terms that Serre sets out, become clear. Maimed bodies clog clear-flowing river. Human violence interrupts the water cycle through which rivers and the sea nourish each other. The nature god Scamander, who normally churns in multiple forms and colors, brown muddy water, clear current, white froth at the sea's edge, now has been overwhelmed by red blood and butchered flesh. Few literary representations of the environmental impact of the Anthropocene violence have ever been so clear. What I'm calling the paradigm of submersion interprets godlike Achilles as a representation of human violence against the watery environment. But more central to the paradigm is Scamander himself, surging into view as anti-sublime, anti-human embodiment of nature's revenge. The hero does not want to fight the river. It shall be as you say, divine Scamander, he poo-poos the god, but he won't stop killing Trojans. The counterforce might feel familiar to anyone who's been caught outside in a hurricane or swept off your feet by a sudden flood. The river surged and swelled and rushed against him, swirling and gathering his streams together to sweep away the multitude of corpses that blocked his waters from the many people killed by Achilles. Roaring like a bull, the river hurled them out onto the land. The strong brown god of the river, to borrow T.S. Eliot's phrase, represents the world ecosystem against which even the greatest of human warriors fails. Scamander is multiple and singular, roaring and surging, hurling bodies and sweeping even the god Achilles off his fleet feet. At this key moment, Anthropos briefly fails to dominate his world. Achilles rose out of the swirling streams and sprinted off across the plain, quick as his feet would go, terrified. The poem's close focus on Achilles' feet recalls both his legendary running abilities and also the heel weakness that Homer at least never gets around to mentioning. In his prayer to Zeus, however, Achilles emphasizes his shame at falling to non-human forces. He hates drowning as, quote, a terrible, humiliating death, trapped in a river like a swineherd boy trying to cross the water in a storm. In this moment of terror, the godlike man fractures, dividing himself between warrior and boy. In this moment also, we can glimpse a rift within the Anthropocene logic of human domination over environment that would characterize the 3 millennia of human civilization that stride the damp earth in the hero's footsteps. Exactly here, as perhaps in no other place in the epic, the world responds to humanity's abhorrence. This strange episode in the Iliad scatters into multiple endings before the larger narratives of the poem continue in Book 22 with the climactic battle of Achilles and Hector. First, to return the river to its banks and at the request of his divine mother Hera, Hephaestus, god of fire and technology, burns the plains. Divine fire erases the multitude of corpses, and the shimmering water was held back. Shaped by a kitchen simile, as when a cauldron on a blazing fire boils as it melts a plump pig's fat, the river god flows back within bounds once again. But the Olympian gods, roused by the human-divine conflict, end up fighting among themselves in elemental chaos that pits Apollo against Hera, and ends up leaving Artemis, goddess of the hunt, crying in her father's lap. Amid the disorder, the Trojan army mostly escapes Achilles' murderous rage by fleeing inside the city gates. Providing a dash of order to the rout, Apollo lures Achilles away from the city, rescues Trojan Prince Agenor from the Greeks' wrath, and, quote, used tricks to keep Achilles distant from the Trojans. When my students have been discussing this scene in Anthropocene terms, they like to point to Apollo's rationality and his presumptive status as Lord of the solar panels to suggest a possible way out of the Anthropocene catastrophe. If we follow the sun god, it's okay. If we follow the sun god, perhaps we won't fall into destruction. I'm not quite as optimistic as my students, though I hate to pop their balloons, and I do think we need hope. And I like solar panels. But my submerging focus today primarily asks what happens to heroic rage for glorious violence when it rouses a watery environmental counterforce. I will look briefly at 2 experimental versions of Homer that help extend and complicate the Anthropocene reading that I adopt from Sayers. The first of these is the earliest fragment of the English poet Christopher Logue's incomplete war music, which in its posthumous publication names itself an account of Homer's Iliad, and that's a little piece of it up on the slide. Logue wrote the sections on Scamander that I'll explore today around 1960, and later pieces of the project appeared in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, with the collected but still incomplete edition published posthumously in 2015. Logue knew no Greek, and his account is experimental, powerful, and intensely moving. He aims to critique the cult of the warrior hero while also giving full expression to the boundless rage at the poem's human center. Logue's Scamander announces himself as pure body, a glistening stack of water, solid, white with sunlight, looming like a giant bone over the circling humans. He's a scary piece of water, just as angry as Achilles. Thickened with carcasses, Scamander growls, my waters stiffen in a putrid syrup. Downstream, the mouth cakes against the standing blood clots, yet you massacre, Greek. Come, quit this loathsome rapture. The physicality of Logue's verse matches the contempt the river feels for his human antagonist. Thick, stiff, putrid, clotted, loathsome. These blood waters cannot be endured. Even more than in Serre's conception of Achilles as the embodiment of world hatred, for Logue, the warrior is pollution itself. The river snarls rage at the man he calls only Greek. My students, who are taught in their elementary schools to have some reverence for classical heroes, feel the river's address to the famous warrior is shockingly impolite. In this violent account of the combat, Achilles fights the river, but his blows find no purchase. As he does not in Wilson's smoother version, this violent warrior knows himself to be immersed and still fights, plucking his knees up, now punting aside a dead man, now swimming a stroke or two. Achilles remembered God's best word and struck like a mad thing against the river. The balance between the hero's actions of kicking away a corpse and swimming through Scamander's liquid form suggests something divided in human nature. Might humans have another way to encounter the river god besides violence? The hero as swimmer is, of course, Odysseus, who mostly appears in the other epic. The decree of grandfather Zeus, represented by Logue as God's best word, however, drives the mad thing hero man into nature's fluid body. He can't win, but he still fights the water. He beat it with the palm of his free hand, sliced at it, at the world ligaments of water. Yes, sliced them. Ah, there, and there, such hatred. In the semi-coherent image of there, 4 times there, Logue voices the warrior's vain attempts to slice liquidity. Some parts of the non-human resist our parsing. The final moments of submersion threaten the hero's breath. Wilson's Achilles doesn't go all the way under, but Logue submerges Achilles' head and fills his mouth. And the water's diamond head shut over Achilles, locked round his waist film after film of sopping froth, then heaved him sideways up while multitudinous crests bubbled around his face, blocking his nostrils with the blood he shed an hour before. Underwater, even Achilles suffers. The blood in his nose may be his own or his foes, he shed both. But his breathing now seems as clogged as Scamander's streams. The diamond head of the river god overwhelms, buries, and smothers heroic might. Hera and her son Hephaestus will come to the river's aid a few lines later, although Logue's surviving fragment stops at the river's retreat to its former banks. The warrior has been submerged, if not quite drowned. The third and briefest response to the episode of Achilles in the river that I'll analyze today in Anthropocene terms appears in Alice Oswald's slim, austere, and emotionally overwhelming book, Memorial. While Wilson gives us thousands of lines of narrative, and even Logue dilates out the episodes he chooses, Wilson's version of the Iliad is tiny. Everything's been excised except the deaths and the similes. She opens with a bare list of 200 names, Protesilaus to Hector, of all the named men who die violently in the epic. Interwoven between grisly depictions of the manner of their bodies' ends, she juxtaposes epic similes, often drawn from the natural world or human domestic labors. Protesilaus's body, which died in midair, jumping to be first ashore, lies adjacent to, quote, like a wind murmur begins a rumor of waves. Nothing to see here but death and the sea. Oswald's poem is hard medicine. Her take on Scamander begins in a simile, not a death scene. But inside her description of the river, the violent man intrudes. Achilles killed so many men, standing downstream with his rude sword hacking off heads until the water burst out in anger, lifting up a ridge of waves that now this whole river is a grave. Oswald's radical art of compression solidifies all the action of book 21 into 2 scant pages. The rude sword of the man hacking hedge submerges corpses into the grave that is the river, that is the world. So many men and just one water body. Between her miniaturized Scamander and the death of Hector, which merits 25 lines in itself, Oswald sandwiches a brief simile about the human act of submersion. It's a paradigm that inverts the drowning of the hero. In this mini counter-epic of just 5 lines, a human body goes down into the water and then comes back up. The anonymous diver, presumably not a warrior, neither armored nor clothed, not having a name that merits a place in the story, nonetheless comes out of the sea with treasure. Like when a man dives off a boat into wind-blackened water, he vanishes, then surfaces, with his thoughts the other way up and his head and his hands full of oysters. In that 2-part microstory, the diver vanishes, then surfaces, Oswald writes a submersion narrative that inverts the violence of Achilles against the river. Her swimmer welcomes the disorientation that comes from the water world's touch. He emerges comfortable with his thoughts the other way up. Bearing the sweet flesh of the sea in his wet hands, he represents a different kind of aquatic relation. The Blue Humanities counterforce in today's talk has mostly been Scamander himself, river god and revenger. But I also have some love for Oswald's nameless oyster diver and the way that he engages with the ocean, or with the water. Okay, whoops, sorry. There we are. So quick conclusion, some lessons of submersion. Swimmers have things to teach us about the sea, and if I had time to unfurl another paradigm, it might engage with buoyancy as a shared principle through which one watery body can support another. But today is for drowning heroes and Anthropocene violence and the destruction that they capture. In conclusion, I'll turn back to Ahab, the tyrannical captain who goes down with his hated whale. Achilles represents in its most extreme version human hatred of other humans, which spills into our spoiling of the world. But in Ahab, Melville invents a, quote, grand, ungodly, godlike man who rages directly against the divine in nature. In Sailing Without Ahab, I undertake to exile that rage and that violence. I'm not sure it's possible all the way. My whalemen in the poems still hurl spears, still hunt whales, still seek the fatty flesh that they render into oil. But in drawing together Melville's narrator and my own seeing and swimming self, these poems advance a divided and third-person I, a split I, an I that is another's, fractured but open to the world. It's the vision of that I with which I'll leave us today, in the words of the final poem in my book. The title of the poem, like the last heading in Melville's novel, is Epilogue. I could say some more things about it, but I think I'll let I have the last words. I alone, I all alone, I floating, coffin buoyed, inscribed wood, the last caress I feels of Q's drowned body. It supports I. Sharks bite it not. Savage seahawks circle, do not descend. I floats, I alone, soft sea, dirge-like. I traces the lines of tattoos carved into the wood. I alone, I seize. Outside the vital center, devious cruising, the Rachel, towards him, retracing, resailing, repatterning pathless waves in search of only finding I alone, another orphan. Thank you. There we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that beautiful and evocative moment and for the lecture. And I am happy to take questions from the floor. Don't be shy. Students or faculty. Shao, you want to go first? Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Exploration have ever found submersion itself as a possible act of violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, in the sense, you know, the submersion of human bodies is itself an act of violence because we have to come back up, right, if we're going to survive submersion. I think that in this talk, I'm thinking about submersion as an alternative to acts of violence, but I think you're right to consider that the aquatic environment for humans is also a place of extreme danger, you know, suffocation is obviously a form of violence, and you know, various forms of water torture are, of course, things that we're familiar with in the present and the past. So I think that the submersion that the paradigm of submersion I'm thinking of here is in some sense a corrective, right? It's the way in which you can sort of shock oneself out of a particular stance of domination or imagined control. But that is not like, and part of the reason it works as a corrective is because it is itself a different form of threat too. I mean, as I said, you know, Scamander is deeply scary. In a moment in which Achilles has been the most terrifying figure in the poem for a long time, right? The Scamander is the one figure who can face him down, which, you know, is nice as a corrective, but still quite terrifying from a human point of view. So thanks. That's a great question.
I was thinking very specifically about facial chemistry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's a great counterexample, I think. Yeah.
Million of questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to come here?
As a hero,
Mm-hmm.
his mom, and she was like putting him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Dipped into the sticks.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if he was made as he is by the river.
Yep.
Very specific one, of course. But how do it respond to what people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the particular legend about Achilles in the river, of course, is about the sticks and about how Thetis, his mother, dips him into the sticks, and except for the place where she's holding him, right, as he's become not human. He looks like a human, but he's mostly unhuman except for this one little place. And so there's a way in which he then is the perfect example of the human who can be confronted by Scamander, which is like the Styx is the river in the underworld. It's the magic river of the gods swear on. But Scamander is the river that flows right outside of the city of Troy, right? Scamander is the river that humans know, that the humans live around. And so this moment in the poem, it seems to me, when Achilles is confronted by the river, like the human river, the river that humans live with, is a moment where the natural environment that has been living with humans as long as there have been humans pushes back, right? Refuses to just simply suffer the brunt of his taste for massacre. And so I think that there's a way that like the magic river that tells Achilles that he's invulnerable is counterbalanced or counter-structured, that's not very well put, by the human river that like knows what it's like to live with human waste and pollution and destruction and just finally asks for it to stop, right? I mean, I'm not sure if that absolutely answers the question, and I think that like there's a odd relation in the story of Achilles between these two rivers, the magical river and the human river. You know, that story about Achilles and the river Styx doesn't appear in the Iliad. It appears in other stories about Achilles, and so I wonder about, like, even if Homer would, like, we know that Homer is not an individual, he's a product of a tradition, but there's a thing about this poem that it doesn't include that episode in it, and I wonder if further conclusions about the two different rivers might be. Yeah. And they're kind of inverses of each other, but it's also because, I mean, Homer doesn't mention this in the poem, but like one way to think about Achilles is that he's sort of launched into the world with the, like his particular kind of egotism is only possible if he has sort of the magical river and magical mom behind him. And so there's a way in which that figure is the perfect figure to be counterbalanced by a river that exists in the world. So Scamander and Styx are kind of opposites in a sense. And it is that, like, Achilles expects to be faced down maybe by the gods and maybe not by anybody else, but he's actually, I mean, Scamander is a god, but he's a different kind of a god from Zeus and Thetis and the others. Thanks, that's a really helpful way to think about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm really curious about what's, I don't know if I'm not really familiar with my thought. Is any plane with fresh water and salty water? Because for me, in the Odyssey,
Yeah.
is really present, but in this case, it's fresh water.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are certain material, physical realities.
Yeah, that, I mean, I do think that like the tension between fresh and salt water is present all over the long literary history of dealing with water. And, you know, like one of the things that I think a lot of people who work in this field are thinking about is the difference between fresh and salt, you know, broadly speaking. It shows up in Shakespeare and other places. You know, the Scamander is tidal, right? Like we know that it's close to the sea, and that so we have the sort of brackish estuary effect. And the poem is interested in like the reason Scamander says he's so mad is that, you know, you're preventing me from getting down to the sea, preventing the interchange between the fresh water in the stream and the salty water in the Aegean. And so there is this kind of sense of the Scamander as participating at least in a cycle that includes both fresh and salt water. And of course, you know, human blood is also like rough, you know, the salt content varies, but it's not that far from the salt content of the, at least of the ocean, of the Aegean. So I think there is both a sense that, again, this comes back to this question of sort of like what is the human point of view and what is the non-human point of view, and Achilles as a purveyor of violence is in some sense the human that refuses the human point of view, right? That he is separate from the freshwater world, the agricultural world. I mean, separate from and also contains it in his shield, but he is like, it strikes me as important that it's the fresh water and the fresh water's relationship to the salt water that is the thing that he clogs, to use the Wilson's term.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, we have so much.
Oh, thank you.
He also arrives in joy by.
Yeah, right.
So but it seems to me that it's his incomplete submersion that is, and that's
from the Styx, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. If she just let him go under. Yeah.
Today, I was just listening to the rhythm feature in the and the way it kind of goes into play. Fully intentional. But submersion,
in different tradition where there's redemption,
Mhm.
is very different.
Yeah,
Would be
the baptismal ruler. Yeah.
I was thinking the same, yeah.
Mhm.
which can be had at any stage, in one's life.
Right. Mhm.
And so I wonder if you wanted to kind of not roll that in,
Mhm.
baptism, so on. Why?
Yeah, thank you. That is a wonderful question, provocation, opening up.
Sorry, I was also thinking about,
Yeah.
quickly a follow-up, I was thinking the same. Venetian churches, of course, are
Mhm.
are full of men in
Yeah.
various degrees of,
Mhm. Of submersion.
of
Yeah,
submersion.
yeah. Mhm.
And I mean, and in medieval times, often there's a lot of it, and
Yeah.
then more recently, less of it, less water,
Mhm.
more water. I don't know if you've been thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, the short version is that I was thinking back with the pre-Christian text primarily in this section, and in the long history, like the baptismal submersion, and certainly in Renaissance humanist understandings of Achilles and Thetis, will understand that through a kind of syncretic understanding of baptism, even though it's like, Achilles is a pre-Christian hero who can be slightly adapted to a kind of humanist syncretic notion. And so I think in a longer project, baptism would be the, as you say, the salvific or the redemptive version of submersion. And I spend a lot of time thinking about swimming as a kind of environmental philosophical practice in the present. And I think that it is not fully separate from, although I can't quite articulate the relationship clearly right now. I think there's something about baptism that still persists in the swimming discourses in the environmental present. And I'm not sure that I'm able to figure out exactly how that connection and transition operates, but I think there's something about putting the human form in water that assumes a ritualistic, and I'm speaking here as someone who does this a lot once the weather gets a little bit warmer, there's something ritualistic and something sacred about it that is, even in a secular context, that hasn't quite thrown off its theological content. So thank you for reminding.
Ritual, yeah.
Or ritual maybe
rather
is,
than, ritual content.
yeah, ritual content.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
No, I was thinking that I've been very struck by how powerful representations of water that
Yep.
exist in, I'm not an expert really on Christian iconography, but there's a, I've been really looking at the water itself and how it is represented in particular scenes of St. John's.
Yep.
And, and very often, I think that your paradigm really works. Kind of looking at these paintings, so it's really where the water is.
Yep.
How submerged St. John is, or the child,
and it also,
and how vivid the water is. It's quite powerful.
Yeah.
How it changes over time.
And it comes back also to the earlier question about submersion as threat too, because there are also these images of the city threatened by the flood, right? So there's a certain kind of submersion that is palatable and salvific, and another kind that is destructive. And that terrifying, and that the moment in which the one switches to the other are almost always in dialogue with each other and always present. Even in the kind of safest version of this, we have the sort of flip to the other side, at least speculatively, imaginatively present. So thank you. That's a great question.
Maybe not ask a question, but maybe ask for your comment. In our answer,
Yeah. Mhm.
that you mentioned, are there any concepts or what
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great question, and like a piece of the analysis of this particular, hyper masculine man goes into river scene. I also am a huge, I've learned so much from Astrida Nemanis's work and her reminder about the sort of multiple articulations of bodies of water, not just the lagoon or the canals, but also human bodies and other water bodies. So I do think that sort of broadly feminist, hydrofeminist maybe, reading of water is very much available to an understanding of this scene. I didn't make it super explicit in my reading of the part of Homer right now, but I definitely think that it is. I think it's a very cogent way to respond, and I think that Nemanis's sort of broader point about water as a kind of connecting structure within bodies and between bodies is incredibly important to the way I think about these things in my reading of literary texts, and also just in like my thinking about human connections and sociality in the present. Well, Scamander's masculine. The river god is a he. So there is, I think if you go through, Poseidon obviously is a male god as well. There are obviously, in the psychoanalytic tradition, which associates rivers with amniotic fluid and the womb, that remains still quite powerful, even if we're somewhat disenchanted with Freud these days. So I think there are multiple ways of understanding fluidity that are gendered in different ways, and even if it's probably true that there is a kind of a kind of generalized sense of the fluid as feminine, I think it's not always like there are elements of the terrifying part of fluidity that are also typed as feminine sometimes, but I think it's not exclusive. Like I think there are various ways. Water assumes so many forms that it tends to be available for different kinds of.
But ocean is male.
Yeah, ocean is male.
Ocean is male. Many rivers are male.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Many rivers are male.
Yeah.
La Piave.
Yeah.
Yeah. The fascist. Yeah.
Oh, is that right? Oh. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
La
Yeah.
Piave is queer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know why the fascists changed that. Oh, because of the war.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so interesting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. A colleague of ours is working on it. Works Francesco Noro, something like that. Francesco Valerani, I can give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How when the river itself became associated with this specific battle over in the First World War. So then it's appropriated by fascists as well.
As part of a military masculine.
Yeah. Please go. Yeah.
I know that there is a version of kind of like experimental translation, but phonetic translation approximating English to the sound of ancient Greek. I don't remember the title, but I was wondering if you know of it and if you looked at the same scene in this, because it's kind of like another aspect of submerging the text or really with the linguistic experiment of changing the language, because I just read the first few lines. I didn't really read the whole text title now. It is very different because it's not an actual translation of sounds. So at first it reads very strangely, like a completely different story. That might be interesting too.
Yeah, I don't know that. It sounds very interesting. I occasionally have run into situations. I can make my way through Latin and Greek with a lot of help from a dictionary and a crib, but I've heard Homer recited by people who can pronounce ancient Greek, and it's just an extraordinary, like the rhythm of it is really gorgeous. And I don't feel like it's accessible to me because I'm not a classicist, but I love the idea that people are taking seriously the sound element and the kind of rhythmic and percussive elements of the poem. Wilson talks a lot about that in the writing she's done around her translation. She also says very clearly that she's writing an iambic pentameter and trying to make an English version that's accessible to a wide variety of readers. But like this attention to sound and rhythm seems really important to me.
I think it's more about the language, so kind of like translating just from someone who doesn't know ancient Greek, they hear the words, approximating them to something in English. So it was more this kind of like meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is an interesting exercise of just like hearing something in another language and trying to respond to it in your own language without content, without translation.
It's a kind of submersion.
Yeah.
Thank you for this beautiful talk. And I have a specific question, a general question, and an announcement. The announcement is that after this, I don't know if you would announce that, but whoever can buy your ocean book is going to get complimentary scripts. The specific question is whether you had a look at Post-Colonial Achilles by Derek Walker, where Achilles is a fisherman.
Yes.
So he is someone who's a submerged hero story.
That's right.
General questions connected to the fact that our mental humanities students here know that I urge them to mix, combine creative and critical. You've written some beautiful or traditional academic books, poetry. I've written a book like The Ocean that is some very solid, readable, and now this. So can you say something more about the creative process, about the joys and perils of combining critical writing and creative writing? Advice. I see a lot of people who now are doing this very moment, so that they benefit from your experience.
Okay, I'll thank you for that question, and I will answer the creative critical question at more length, but just very quickly, the Walcott Omeros is a lovely. I mean, I love that poem. I didn't actually turn back to it when I was writing this, so I wonder if it's like a missing piece, and maybe if I go on to think about this more, I mean that Achille is a waterman in this very explicit way, a man who works on the water, and Walcott, of course, writes so gorgeously about water technologies and water craft and water smell and water feeling. So I'd like to go back to it. I actually haven't been back to it in a little while. On the creative critical, I mean, this is something that I also deeply believe in, encourage my students to work in. I there are things about working on the border of the creative and the critical that you're sort of neither fish nor fowl sometimes. Like I feel like, I mean, I do have a book of poetry coming out, but I don't feel like I'm like a real poet. I'm like a professor. But there is this, like,
we do have a poet in the room, a real poet.
Yes. So I don't know if I'm allowed in the club, but I think that for me there are certain things that really that for me that I feel like ask to be articulated in a very kind of with footnotes, kind of scholarly, historical, and literary textual research, looking at the things that we are trained to do as traditional academics. And then there are other things that are often connected to them that ask for different forms of communication. For me, the most interesting thinking and the work that is most rewarding and the most enlivening is the work that moves from one to the other. And that in these moments of transition from you know, a kind of more scholarly traditional practice to a poetic or an open practice. It's like I don't feel like I ever quite leave all of the academic behind when I'm in the poetic mode, and I also feel like I bring some of the poetic mode into the academic. You know, I feel like they're always connected to each other, but it's that moment in which you're moving between them and maybe not even knowing which mode is the primary one all the time. That for me, that is, you know, you can get to some things employing, you know, two different bags of tricks than you can't if you're just stuck in one mode. And that's not to be at all, you know, dismissive of people who work exclusively on one. You know, I have a huge respect and admiration. I learn a lot from traditional academic scholarship. I learn a lot from, you know, poets and creative writers who don't, you know, who don't do footnotes at all. And I recognize that there are lots of other people who work on both sides of these boundaries. But for me, like, there's a particular value in, you know, in sort of coming back to one discourse when you've been in the other one for a little while. I think that there's things that you thought you knew that look strange, and things that you didn't know that you can encounter in a different way. And so that's the real value of it for me. I might also say, and maybe we could chat about this at length later with people who are in this mode. You know, in the landscape of publishing, in the academic and para-academic worlds in the present, there is a wider range of possibility for non-traditional publishing now than say when I was
10 years ago.
when I was in grad school in the 90s. I think a lot of the stuff was not available and like didn't exist. You know, and this sort of the open source para-academic world is, I mean, you know,
even autofiction.
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of things that are available now, and it's not always going to be true that like your professors are the people who know about it. I mean, in some ways, it's more likely that your peers are you know, are going to have a clearer idea of the landscape of this sort of stuff than you know, old people like me. The Sailing with That Ahab book? You know, that's a weird one, because I sort of came up with the structure a long time ago, and I thought, wow, no one would ever want to read that. But like, what if I just like took Ahab out of the picture entirely and like reimagined the whole thing? It's like, no, that's a crazy idea. And then, but it was a crazy idea that didn't ever get all the way out of my mind. And you know, I like wrote a little piece. I wrote a couple poems of it, and I published them in a para-academic, you know, Glasgow Review of Books open source thing. And I said, well, maybe I'll do some more. And then I got distracted with other things. And then COVID, and I was at home for months and months. And I thought, like, maybe I'll like really do this project. And so it is also, I mean, it is also a little bit of a COVID project. And, you know, it really is like half of it is about my encounter with my very local piece of Long Island Sound, you know, right down the street from my house, you know, with like me and my dog, and the very local world that we all were thrown into for a period of time. And so again, it's like moving back and forth between those things. That's why I love that map that John Greenlee made for me, because it's like half an upside down version of the globe, and half like a couple hundred yards of coast of like an obscure 100 yards of coastline that I happen to know really well.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
The poem Death by Water, which I mean, is thing that I remember of this expedition. And I wanted to ask you how that, if you went back to it by writing the book and this expedition, and how that improved the process. Also, your stance on that kind of thing.
Yeah. right, or drowning. Yeah. And I think it comes back to the question that was inspired by the Chopin earlier. And I think drowning is I mean, Achilles doesn't quite drown, right? It's like a side trip into possible drowning, and then he gets rescued, and then we go back to the main part of the story. There's a lot of people who drown in Moby Dick, although at the end I'm focused on the one guy who gets out. So I mean, I wasn't thinking specifically of death by water. I was quoting from Four Quartets. I do not know much about gods, but I think the river is a strong brown god, which is the opening of, I think, the third one. Yeah. But I think that, I mean, Eliot, through the Christian imagery of baptism, through his like lifetime engagement with Shakespeare's The Tempest, which also shows up in the Wasteland, I think he's often, I won't say always because I'm not an Eliot expert, but like pretty obsessively coming back to these images of water as transformational in the dual sense of, you know, death and rebirth, right? I haven't been back to the death by water section of the Wasteland in a little while, but I do think that for Eliot, there's a very like both the violent shock of immersion and the salvific redemptive arc of baptism are really important to Eliot's, like both the early Eliot and the late Eliot. So yeah, I think there's a lot in his poetics around water.
Yeah.
Yeah, just when you were saying that station was geographical isolation.
Yeah.
I think Charles Olson writing for this history about
Gloucester. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And performing this kind of outward.
Yes.
Subject position. Well, then started thinking about the relationship just to well, in light of the hybrid or forest boundary between
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whether feel like it's a question of form, the poetry can more dynamically intertwine with material dynamics, so than maybe the kind of form parameters of academic writing offer. And in the poem that you read, the final poem in the book, I mean, that seems to me.
Yeah.
And so this is very sort of how pattern in writing maybe something that is the kind of self-unfolding.
Yeah.
Such kind of formally can understand the work. Talks about the relationship with navigation, with the writer as a navigator. Yeah, if you have any relations to maps as well.
Yeah.
The tattoo and
yeah. So
maps and navigation.
Yeah, I mean, I love that question. Charles Olson is like an absolute hero of mine, and the Maximus poems is like one of the texts that like has massively changed the way I think about about New England coastline, about poetry and history, about the way you can intertwine the global and the very, very local. So yeah, I mean, I've been sort of wrestling with Maximus for a long time. I also think that like Olson in those poems is one example of like how much academic historical research can get into a highly modernist experimental poetic form. So I think that I had someone, I did a reading out of this project a couple of weeks ago, and someone mentioned that, you know, in Call Me Ishmael, Olson's book about Moby Dick, he says that like Moby Dick doesn't become a novel until its second draft, which is when Melville added Ahab. And that what I'm doing in my book is subtracting Ahab. And I said, well, but I like the last thing I want to do is feel like I'm contradicting Olson, who's like one of my idols. But I also think that was a really interesting kind of back and forth structure. I didn't do that consciously. But Call Me Ishmael is another one of those books that's always, you know, knocking around in my subconscious on some level. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the same kind of structure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I could have more to say about navigation and poetics and form. I think of it a lot in relationship to form as practice in various kinds of maritime labor, including swimming, as a practice and a form. And I think that like the way that poets look for forms that are efficient to the task, and the way that swimmers and boat builders and sailors and map makers do, are all like engaging in a formal relationship with water in its various forms. And that in some broad sense are deeply parallel and can sort of learn from each other. So yeah, thank you.
Two more questions. You have exactly two. Excellent.
Yeah. Aquaman. Oh yeah.
Oh, Aquaman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. And he's kind of muscle bound for a swimmer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, so that's a play on a line from Melville about Kokovoko, which is the island that Queequeg comes from. Melville says, "You will not find it on any map. True places never are." Yeah. And so there's this idea that it's an idealized version. Queequeg is, I mean, I've been writing about Queequeg as Aquaman since before the movies came out, since 2009, and so I think about Queequeg, the Little Mermaid, a couple other figures as attempts to imagine a kind of human ocean hybrid. Aquaman in the films is another example. I mean, like, so there's lots, I think, in that. If you really want to hear me say what I think of the Aquaman, like, big Hollywood movies, which I kind of, they're a little bit my guilty pleasure. I have written at excruciating length about both the first one and the second one on my blog, if you want to find it. So I won't like make everybody sit through it now, and I recognize that they're like ridiculous Hollywood like things, but I find them like deeply cheesily pleasurable.
And on that note, I think thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.